May 5. Update. Supreme Court 6-3 emergency ruling triggers nationwide legal fallout. What it means next. 6 people made a decision. 6 people in black robes, sitting in a marble building in Washington, D.C., made a ruling that could reshape American democracy for the next 50 years. And most people woke up that morning, had their coffee, dropped their kids off at school, went to work, without realizing that something had just shifted beneath their feet. This is not a story about politics. Not really. This is a story about power, about who gets to choose the people who make the laws that govern your life, and about a decision so sweeping, so historic, that even the justices who voted against it called the consequences far-reaching and grave. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what just happened and why it affects every single American, no matter where you stand, no matter how you vote. Think about the last time you felt like your vote didn't matter. Maybe you live in a district where one party always wins. Always. No matter what. Where you show up, you cast your ballot, and somehow, the outcome never changes. You wonder if anyone is actually listening. You wonder if your voice counts. There's a word for what you might be experiencing. It's called gerrymandering. And it is the political equivalent of rigging the game before the players even take the field. Here's the simple version. The people in power draw the lines on the map that define your voting district. They get to decide which neighborhood goes with which district. And if they do it cleverly enough, they can guarantee that their party wins over and over again, even in places where the majority of voters disagree with them. For 60 years, there was a law designed to stop the worst version of that, to protect communities of color specifically, because history showed, repeatedly and brutally, that those communities were the ones most likely to be silenced, carved up, and pushed to the margins. That law was called the Voting Rights Act. And last week, the Supreme Court of the United States gutted it in a 6-3 decision. Let that sink in. Her name is Sheila. She's 61 years old. She lives in a small town in Louisiana, a state where, right now, Black Americans make up over a third of the population. She has voted in every single election since she turned 18. Presidential elections, midterms, local school board votes, every single one. She doesn't do it because she thinks it's easy. She does it because her grandmother told her about the men and women who marched, who bled, who died so that she would have the right to walk through that door and cast that ballot. When the Supreme Court released its ruling last Wednesday, Sheila's phone started buzzing. Friends texting, family calling, a nephew who said, "Grandma Sheila, what does this mean for us?" And she didn't have an answer, because what the Supreme Court just did is something she, and millions like her, never thought they'd see again in their lifetime. What would you do in that situation? What would you say to a child asking you if their vote is going to count? To understand what just happened, you need to understand the history. And I promise, I will make it simple. After the civil rights movement, after years of marches and murders and fire hoses turned on peaceful protesters, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965. It was one of the most powerful pieces of legislation ever signed into American law. Its purpose was blunt and necessary. Stop states from silencing Black voters and other communities of color through discriminatory voting practices. One of its most important tools was something called Section 2. Section 2 said that if you draw a voting map, a congressional district, in a way that dilutes the voting power of a racial minority group, that map is illegal. Courts could strike it down, communities could fight back. For decades, it worked. Not perfectly, but it worked. Then, piece by piece, the court started chipping away. In 2013, they weakened another major part of the law. In 2019, they ruled that federal courts couldn't touch partisan gerrymandering, meaning politicians could draw districts purely for partisan advantage, and no court could stop them. And now, in the spring of 2026, they've gone even further. Here's what was happening specifically in Louisiana. After the 2020 census, the state was required to redraw its congressional map. Civil rights groups argued, and lower courts agreed, that Louisiana needed a second congressional district where Black voters had a meaningful voice. The state fought it all the way to the Supreme Court. And that's when things took a turn. On April 29, 2026, the Supreme Court released its decision in Louisiana versus Callais. 6 justices voted in the majority, 3 dissented. The 6, all appointed by Republican presidents. The 3 dissenters, all appointed by Democratic presidents. The alignment was not a coincidence. Justice Samuel Alito, writing for the majority, said that Louisiana's map, the one drawn to comply with the Voting Rights Act, the one that created a second Black majority district, was actually itself an unconstitutional racial gerrymander. Let me repeat that, because it is extraordinary. The court said that drawing a map to protect Black voters' voting power was unconstitutional. In her scathing dissent, Justice Elena Kagan wrote that the ruling eviscerated the law. She said the consequences are likely to be far-reaching and grave. She said that today's decision renders Section 2 all but a dead letter. A dead letter, meaning the protection still exists on paper. But in practice, it no longer has teeth. This is where everything changed. Okay, here's what the court actually did. In plain language, imagine you have a neighborhood. In that neighborhood, 40% of the residents are members of a minority group. They've historically struggled to get their voices heard in local government. So the law said, when you draw district lines, you have to make sure these voters have a real shot at electing someone who represents them. That's what Section 2 required. It was about outcomes, making sure that the political process is equally open to everyone, regardless of race. What the court just said is, proving that is almost impossible now. You have to prove intentional discrimination. Not just that the map looks discriminatory, not just that the map results in minority voters being silenced. You have to prove someone sat down and intended to discriminate. And then you have to prove it in court, against well-funded legal teams with a nearly impossible standard of evidence. Here's the analogy. Imagine you're trying to prove a store discriminates against you. The old law said, if the pattern of behavior consistently harms you, that's enough to take action. The new ruling says, unless you can prove the manager personally told his staff to target you, you have no case. You see the problem. Now here's what that actually means in practice. The consequences started arriving before the ink was even dry on the ruling. Within 1 hour of the Supreme Court's decision, the Republican-controlled Florida House approved a new congressional map, a dramatically gerrymandered map, one that analysts say could net Republicans 4 additional House seats in the 2026 midterms. Think about what that means. Democrats in Florida, Kathy Castor, Darren Soto, Jared Moskowitz, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, suddenly found themselves in districts redrawn to ensure their defeat. And it didn't stop there. Arkansas, Missouri, Mississippi, North Carolina, Ohio, South Carolina, Republican-controlled states began making moves, signaling that they, too, would redraw their maps under the new legal landscape the court just created. One analysis found that this ruling could lead to white candidates winning 15 House seats currently held by Black members of Congress, a level of racial revanchism, they said, not seen since the end of Reconstruction. Think about that for a moment. Since the end of Reconstruction, we are talking about a rollback of representation not seen in well over a century. And it doesn't just affect Congress. Local school boards, city councils, state legislatures, judicial elections. The Voting Rights Act has been used at every level of government to protect minority voters. Every single one of those protections just became dramatically harder to enforce. For Sheila and the millions of Americans like her, this isn't an abstract legal debate. It's the question of whether someone who looks like her, lives in her community, understands her struggles, will ever sit in a seat of power and make decisions that affect her life. But here's the part no one is talking about. This ruling doesn't just hurt one community. It fundamentally changes the nature of American elections, for everyone. Here's why. Before this decision, there was a check on political map-making. Parties couldn't simply draw whatever map they wanted, because if it harmed minority voters, courts could intervene. The Voting Rights Act acted as a restraint on both parties on how extreme their gerrymandering could get. That restraint is now gone. What the court effectively said is, partisan gerrymandering is untouchable, and racial gerrymandering is now almost impossible to prove, which means that for the first time in 60 years, politicians can draw maps with almost total impunity. Democrats are already responding. California has a new map. Virginia approved new lines. New York is considering disbanding its independent redistricting commission so the legislature can draw maps in retaliation. You see what's happening? Both parties, pushed by a Supreme Court decision, are now racing to gerrymander as aggressively as possible. The voters caught in the middle? They don't have a choice. They're the ones who get carved up. One election expert put it clearly. In the partisan war the Supreme Court just inflamed, the parties caught in the middle are the election officials and the voters. There are not going to be any winners here. Except, of course, the politicians who drew the maps. Now, before we go any further, let me address some things I know you might be thinking. First, this does not mean the Voting Rights Act is dead. It still exists. Section 2 is still on the books. The court specifically said it was not striking the law down. But as Justice Kagan made clear in her dissent, a law that exists on paper but cannot be meaningfully enforced is functionally the same as no law at all. Second, this is not simply a partisan story. Yes, the ruling fell 6-3 along ideological lines, but the downstream effects of unleashed gerrymandering will be felt in every community, in every state, by voters of every political affiliation. When maps are drawn to protect incumbents rather than represent people, every voter loses a little something. Third, this is not irreversible. Congress has the power to pass new legislation. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which passed the House in 2021, would restore and strengthen these protections. It has been stalled in the Senate. The Congressional Black Caucus is demanding a vote immediately. Whether that happens depends entirely on who controls the Senate, which, as of 2026, takes us back to the elections this ruling will directly influence. The irony is not lost on anyone. So where does this go from here? In the short term, chaos. Louisiana's primary is May 16th, just 2 weeks away. The state must redraw its map with almost no time. Multiple states are calling special legislative sessions. Election officials across the country are scrambling. In the medium term, the 2026 midterms will be the first national election held in the shadow of this decision. Analysts estimate that depending on how states redraw their maps, Republicans could net somewhere between 15 and 19 additional House seats, not because they won more votes, but because of how the lines were drawn. That's not a hypothetical. That's a structural advantage baked into the map before a single vote is cast. In the long term, this ruling will define American electoral politics for a generation. The court's conservative supermajority, 6 justices appointed by Republican presidents, has now effectively declared all gerrymandering constitutional. Partisan gerrymandering cannot be challenged in federal court. Racial gerrymandering is nearly impossible to prove. The restraints are gone. What fills that vacuum matters enormously. Congress could act. States could pass independent redistricting commissions. Voters could organize in massive numbers, making themselves, as one advocate put it, too big to rig. The NAACP is holding town halls. Community organizers are on the ground. Voter registration drives are ramping up. Because here's the truth that every authoritarian in history has eventually confronted. You can draw the lines wherever you want, but you cannot contain a people who are determined to be heard. 60 years ago, men and women marched across a bridge in Selma, Alabama. They were beaten, they were gassed, they kept marching, and the country watched, and eventually, Congress acted. The Voting Rights Act was born out of blood and sacrifice and a moral clarity that this nation imperfectly managed to find. Last Wednesday, 6 justices decided that that clarity had expired. They did not strike down the law by name. They simply drained it of meaning. Slowly, quietly, in the technical language of legal opinions that most people will never read. But the effects will not be quiet. The effects will be felt in living rooms and polling stations and city halls across America. They will be felt by Sheila and by her nephew, and by every community that has spent decades fighting simply to have their voice count as much as anyone else's. History is watching. And history, it should be noted, has a long memory. The question is not what the Supreme Court decided. The question is what we decide next. Because in the end, in a democracy, however imperfect, the power still belongs to the people. And that is a truth no ruling, no map, and no majority of 9 can ever fully take away. Subscribe if this video gave you something to think about. Share it with someone who needs to understand what's happening right now. And leave a comment. Tell me, what do you think happens next?